let's talk about the 49ers. This is the meat and potatoes of the show right here. So, bottom line, are they good at drafting? I mean, this is an interesting thing because it's easy to point out where all the flaws are. And we also live in a bit of a bubble where we really pick through every single thing that the 49ers do, good and bad. And living in that bubble or that silo can kind of close you off to what other teams are doing good and bad. And maybe you think one way, but if it's really broken down, you're like, wow, it's not actually that way. So in your opinion, do you believe that the 49ers are good at drafting?
So this is interesting because I think it depends on how you define what's good at drafting, right? So I think there's a school of thought where you draft, and if a certain percentage of your draft picks end up becoming, players on your team, starters, rotational players, then hey, you're good at drafting. Or if, you certain play, like certain rounds of the draft, you're able to get certain type of talent, then hey, you're good at drafting. Or, there's I think there's a GM or a coach, I forget who it was, but says, if you get an all-pro player out of your whole draft, your whole draft was a success. And if you go by that type of logic, then yeah, the 49ers are excellent at drafting, because ever since like 2017, each draft they've had at least a all-pro, if not two all-pros. 2017 it was Kittle, 18 I think it was Fred Warner, 19 both Bosa and Debo, 20 Ayuk, 21 Huff, 22, you got Brock Purdy in that draft, and he's borderline last season, could have been an all-pro, right? So to me, when you look at it that way, yeah, the 49ers are great at drafting. But the issue for me, Jesse, is how much they've missed in the first round. They've had 7 first-round picks. Only 2 are still on the team. Now, those 2 are Nick Bosa and Brandon Ayuk, both all pros. So you're like, yeah, they're great. But to have 7 first-round pick and 5 of those guys aren't even on your roster. Some of those guys you traded up to get, i.e. Reuben Foster. You've missed on guys up and down, like when you pick a guy like Javon Kinlaw, you could have potentially got, I think Tristan Wirfs was in that draft there, whatnot. So to me, I think it's a mixed bag for the 49ers. I think that they're fine and solid. Like, I would take what they have. I don't think they're terrible at drafting, Jesse, but I think it's because of how much they've been bailed out in later rounds. Their ability to, and I think what their biggest issue is their ability to stay disciplined with best player available. And what I mean by that is, in the later round draft picks, they tend to stick to best player available, and that's when they've had the most success. With the higher rounds, and what I mean by higher rounds, first, second, and third round, they tend to, like what you just mentioned, they tend to identify a position and pick the best player that they feel like is at a specific position. And that's where I feel like they've gotten into a lot of trouble, because they're identifying position instead of just taking the best athlete, the best player on the board, which is where they end up having a lot of success. So, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I wouldn't say they're the best at drafting. I wouldn't say they're the worst at drafting. But I would say, they're like top. They wouldn't be like, they would still be in the honors classes. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. There was something I stumbled on like 2 years ago. It was a graph, and it broke down teams' draft picks and, how often they hit and all those other things. And I wish I could find it. And I wasn't successful for this, but I was able to stumble upon some other things. And I want to show this to everybody, because there is no exact science. Kind of to your point, where it's like, hey, if you get an all-pro, that should be a successful draft. I think when we look at it, especially when we look at the first round, we expect elite players. And when you don't have that, Mike McGlinchey is a great example, right? A good player. He got a second contract in the league, but we look at that and say, kind of a bust for the 49ers. But here's the reality. And this is how I'm going to gauge success. And this is why I say the 49ers are actually really good drafters. So do you realize that 60% of the players that are drafted make it to their second contract? So immediately, no matter where they're drafted, almost half the players don't even make it to contract number 2, whether it's from injury, they're just not good enough, whatever. They don't make it. They get in trouble with the law, who knows. But 60%, only 60% make it to contract number 2. Less than half of those players that make it to contract number 2 make it to contract number 2 with the same team that drafted them, which is crazy. So out of the 60%, less than half of those players make it to contract number 2 with the team that drafted them. So we're talking about less than 30% of the overall players drafted are going to make it to contract number 2 with the team that drafted them. So here's the breakdown, and I've got it right here. 31% of players drafted in round 1 make it to contract number 2 with the same team that drafted them. Okay, so you look at guys like Kinlaw, where maybe Kinlaw makes it to contract number 2. He's a part of that 60% that make it to contract number 2, but he wasn't good enough to make it to contract number 2 with the 49ers. He needed to change his scenery, right? So he's successful, but not really, right?
And I don't think it's always going to be good enough. Sometimes it's cap, right? Sure. You don't have the cap, so I don't want to. Sure. I mean, with Kinlaw, obviously, we didn't want to invest in him, but I don't think that's always the case, right? Sometimes it's going to be
absolutely
like Brian Burns, right? Let's say Brian Burns didn't sign his second contract with Panthers. Obviously, he's good enough to be on the team. They just couldn't afford him. Khalil
Mack, that's fair.
Guy, so
that's totally fair. And there's things on. Yeah, right. Okay, totally fair. So there's players that go to another team because they are worth a ton of assets sometimes. So that was a successful draft pick. Forrest Buckner, I don't think anybody would say he was a bust. His second contract was with another team because of that. Okay, that's totally fair. But the way I'm going to gauge success just for this exercise, because I think it's the only fair way that I can think of, is let's just go off of what the numbers tell us. The numbers tell us that 31% of players drafted in round 1 make it to contract number 2 with the team that drafted them. Well, the 49ers, as bad as we assume that they are at drafting players in round 1, 29%, so 2% under the norm of their first round draft picks, have made it or are on their way to making it. Some of this is a projection. Obviously, I'm projecting Ayuk to get a second contract with the 49ers. So 29% puts them almost in line with the league average of players drafted that they drafted that have made it to a second contract with them.